Expansionary fiscal policy is widely regarded these days as a debatable topic. If government were to engage in expansionary fiscal policy, then there are always going to be some critics who argue against this kind of policy stance. Let's look at the kinds of criticisms that are sometimes made and then think about what objections might be made to these criticisms. Let's go through them one at a time. Expansionary fiscal policy could fuel inflation. Well, putting a Keynesian hat on, the first thing we would say is, well, maybe it won't. It really depends on whether there's a substantial amount of unemployment in the economy or not. If the economy is operating close to full employment, then it's true that expansionary fiscal policy would contribute to inflationary pressure. However, if there is substantial unemployment in the economy, then it is less likely that there will be inflationary pressure at all. The second point is that let's say there were inflationary pressure due to expansionary fiscal policy designed to reduce unemployment. A Keynesian might well say, well, so what? If it's a choice between reducing human misery of unemployment versus the mild inconvenience of higher prices, then we're going to choose to create inflation in order to reduce unemployment. They might argue that as long as the inflation, the increase in inflation, is predictable, then agents, that is economic decision makers, can adjust to that. Interest rates can rise correspondingly to the higher inflation rate, and wages can rise correspondingly to the higher inflation rate, so that in real terms there's no substantial change. Another objection to expansionary fiscal policy is this: increasing the budget deficit would entail increasing government borrowing, which would unfairly increase the public debt burden on future generations. Well, if the budget deficit stimulates the economy and results in higher future national income, then it means that the economy and the government has a higher capacity to pay off that debt. If the increase in national income as a result of a budget deficit is greater than the increase in interest payments, then future generations aren't worse off due to a budget deficit and a public debt. They're actually better off. Think of an analogy with your parents. Say your parents decide to borrow money to purchase an investment of some kind, a property or something like that. And let's say that that investment brings in a return which is greater each year than the interest payments that have to be made on the loan. Let's say you inherit the debt and the asset, which yields a return each year. That return's greater than the interest payments you have to make on the debt. Are you worse off? No, you're actually better off. You say thank you to your parents for engaging in borrowing. Similarly, if the government borrows to fund a budget deficit, which stimulates the economy, and ideally stimulates the economy in the long term by investment in infrastructure, education and R&D, then future generations would be grateful that the government had engaged in borrowing to fund a budget deficit now. Anyway, the servicing of the public debt, that is the annual interest payments which have to be made for our actual real net public debt, is less than 2% of GDP, which is very small. It's easily affordable. The government could easily increase a budget deficit, borrow more money to fund that budget deficit, and because interest rates currently are so low, the interest payments that would have to be made would not substantially increase. What about this argument? This is a tricky argument against expansionary fiscal policy. Assuming the government lowers taxes to increase the budget deficit, it will have to increase taxes in the future to pay off the additional public debt created now. Since people know this, they will save some of their income now in order to pay those higher taxes in the future. Thus, the lower taxes will not result in higher consumption spending, and therefore will not stimulate the economy at all. Alright, that's a very tricky argument. This is an old argument actually. This is a version of what's called the Ricardian equivalence argument, and was revived in the 1970s by a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Robert Barrow. The chief objection to this criticism is that most households simply aren't as smart, as far-sighted, or as intergenerationally altruistic as is assumed by the argument. It might be true that Nobel Prize-winning economists think in that way, but it's not true that the average plumber, bricklayer, or even academic thinks in that way. Thus, an increased budget deficit now is indeed likely to stimulate consumption spending now, and will trigger a multiplier effect that stimulates the economy. Lucky last, a criticism of expansionary fiscal policy is this: instead of focusing on fiscal policy, why not use expansionary monetary policy instead? That is, reduce interest rates on borrowing for investors and households and stimulate the economy that way. Well, the problem with this is that the interest rates are already at historic lows. The official cash rate, which governs the interest rates of the banks, is currently only 0.25% now. Cutting interest rates further is unlikely to have much of an impact, and in the current circumstances of, for example, the coronavirus crisis, cutting interest rates insofar as they can be cut is hardly going to result in an explosion of investment expenditure. Investors now are nervous and pessimistic about the future, not optimistic. You can reduce the interest rate to 0, doesn't mean they're going to borrow money if they don't think they'll get a return on that investment. So, cutting interest rates in a crisis environment, or cutting interest rates when they're already at historic lows, is unlikely to stimulate the economy. Monetary policy is unlikely to be a particularly effective tool. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is more likely to have an impact.